Hi everyone, welcome to this new webinar on the impact of ballistic missile defense on missile proliferation. I am Etienne Marcus, an associate fellow at the Strategic Research Foundation, FRS, the French think tank. And today I have the pleasure to welcome three distinguished guests. So I have with me Emmanuel Maître, who is a senior research fellow at FRS and who co-authored the study we are going to discuss today. We also have Susanna, who is a research analyst and program administrator at the London-based IISS think tank. And finally, Siki, who is a military and security studies analyst teaching at the Izmir University of Economics in Turkey. Thank you guys for being with us today. So for the audience, we are going first to discuss the study among the panelists, and then you're welcome to ask us questions on the chat, and we'll go through the question as far as we can. So Emmanuel, you wrote this note titled "The Shield and the Sword: The Impact of Ballistic Missile Defense on Missile Proliferation" as part of the European program supporting the Hague Code of Conduct. Could you first introduce this program in a few words and then explain the reason behind the publication of this note?
Sure, thank you very much. First of all, a couple of words about the Hague Code of Conduct, which is not always very well known. So it's a piece of international regulation that was adopted in 2002. It currently has 145 countries, and its basic objective is to call states that have ballistic missiles to restraint in the development and in the export of technologies that may be used for the production of ballistic missiles able to carry WMDs. In addition to restraints, it also encourage subscribing states to display transparency on their programs and on their launches, both for ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles. This instrument was adopted in 2002, and the European Union has been supporting the instrument, trying to promote its universalization as part of its strategy against the proliferation of WMD. The first EU decision on the program was in 2008, and the EU has selected the Fondation for Strategic Research to implement its program of support. So this, of course, takes the form of some outreach démarches and events to try to promote the code, but also publications that we write very regularly to try to reflect on ballistic missile proliferation itself. And try to address key issues that may arise on this topic. And of course, over the past few months, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussions about ballistic missile defense in the framework of the announcements of the Trump administration regarding Iron Dome and then Golden Dome for America. And so we try to explore a little bit what would be the impact of this announcement, of these developments on ballistic missile proliferation. Of course, the topic of missile defense is not new. It is something that, technologically speaking, came very early in the history of this program, as early as late 50s, beginning of the 60s. It has been regulated by the ABM Treaty in 1972, and then we've had several discussions already, some very ambitious programs, the strategic defense initiatives in the 80s with the Reagan administration, with the Bush administration. There was the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, and as well as some ambitions to try to develop ballistic missile as a response to ballistic proliferation, which was perceived at the time as a very serious concern. So this is not new. What is clearly interesting and important, I would say, and in the future will probably change a little bit or shift the perception of this issue is that, of course, Golden Dome is extremely ambitious in its scope. It's not just, I would say, an upgrade of what currently exists. It's really a new dimension, and it has the potential to have a real impact on the trends that we see regarding ballistic missile proliferation. Noting as well that the context is evolving and has some new features that really pushed us to explore this question again. First of all, of course, the question of technological innovations, development, with the possibility of using space as a domain in which to deploy some of the assets. Second, of course, the change of strategic context. We're no longer in the Cold War with a bilateral discussion between offense and defense, but there are many players that are interested not only, of course, in defensive capacities, but as well as offensive capacities. And lastly, and maybe more importantly, the fact that missile defense has been used extensively on the ground, and so we have some feedback about what may work or not. So all that together really led us to consider this paper and to write this paper, to really look at the consequences historically and what we can expect, and also to question what role confidence building measures such as the Hague Code of Conduct may play in this phase in the framework of these developments.
Thank you very much. So now let's dig into it. And could you explain us a little bit how has the paradigm shift linked to the renewal of missile defense been illustrated in recent conflicts, such as between Israel and Iran or Russia and Ukraine?
Sure. Of course, as I said, one of the things that is that calls for re-examining the way that the dialectic between offense and defense is working is clearly the fact that we have experience of the use of ballistic missiles as strike weapons, weapons used massively in conflicts, and of course ballistic missile defense to try to defeat those attacks. I think the lessons that have been learned so far are the first one of them is that it can work to some extent in some conditions, and of course we've seen that it has led many countries in Europe, but also in Asia, in the Middle East, to invest in this type of capacities. So it has really there's been a clear interest for developing these type of systems that comes directly from the experience of the use of ballistic missile defense in Israel and in Ukraine. If we look a little bit more in detail at the two situations, which are, of course, very different, I think in Ukraine, we have seen that ballistic missile defense could, in some situation, intercept, including the most sophisticated ballistic missiles, but it is rather rare to this day. Most of the ballistic missiles that are being launched by Russia are not intercepted by Ukraine, and this is largely caused by the fact that Russia is also using massively other types of means of deliveries, such as drones and cruise missiles. So there is a saturating effect, which means that it is more difficult for to intercept the most efficient ballistic missiles. What seems to apply in this situation is a kind of industrial competition of what can be produced more rapidly and more efficiently between the offensive weapons and the defensive weapons. And we tend to see that the hope that both actors had at the beginning, that they would be able to, on the one side, saturate the interceptor and make sure for Russia that Ukraine would no longer be able to defend themselves has not taken place. On the other side, the hope that Russia would not be able industrially to produce as many missiles or to continue at the same rate its attack has not worked either. Looking at Israel, of course, here it's a different situation with a country that has invested for years on these systems, which has been able with some success to defend its territory against less advanced, less sophisticated missiles. with the of course a very important factor that it is a much smaller country that with a much smaller territory to defend. Here, nonetheless, I would say the efficiency must be also somewhat nuanced in that it has not been 100% efficient. Some missiles have gone through, and the question of the exhaustion of interceptors has also been raised. And so here again, the fact that a strong industrial base was necessary to sustain this type of strategy of interception in the long run has clearly been visible. And here it should be also mentioned that regarding Israel, the choice was made to not only intercept and wait for the strikes, but also to launch, to try to destroy the launchers preemptively, which is, of course, an important addition to the defensive strategy. So, as I was saying, clearly there is interest for developing ballistic missiles, which derives from the observation that it can be useful on the ground, that the massive missile deployments and massive missile use are producing are fueling, I would say, this interest, with as consequences and it is of course the in the title of the paper, the consequences that states are in response trying to increase their arsenals, offensive arsenals, whether it is quantitatively or qualitatively. So in terms of quantity, of course, we've seen just the mass production of systems, but also the efforts to try to create or to produce and to use alternative means of delivery, which might be cheaper and which might help saturate the defense. At the qualitative level, it is the sophistication of systems with the addition, for instance, of penetration aids, or the efforts that we see in some countries, for instance, the DPRK, to produce or to develop systems that can be maneuverable, or even to develop hypersonic warheads to try to defeat the defense.
So the two examples you mentioned, Israel and Ukraine, were more on the, well, let's say, theater size. It was not strategic defense. And we see that the major power could be the US, Russia, China. For example, China invaded the HQ-29 recently in last September. So it's an exoatmospheric ABM system. Russia is investing a lot also on strategic defense, but the most emblematic project is, of course, the US Trump administration Golden Dome. How can such systems can have an impact on the strategic stability?
So this question is considered, I would say, in the paper both historically and also trying to look forward at what may take place. Historically, it is of course the dilemma of the Cold War and the reflection that took place in the Soviet Union and in the US, where they realized pretty early on that the development of missile defense was maybe doable, but it would be extremely costly, and it would lead the adversary to develop more offensive missiles. And so the decision was made, I would say, more for cost issues than really stability issues, to try to curb the development of the defensive system. And that was the thinking behind the adoption of the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty of 1972. What is interesting is that it has then this logic that ballistic missile could hurt strategic stability because it could give to one country the impression that it was not vulnerable anymore to a retaliatory strike, has really developed as the understanding of what stability should be, with the idea of mutual vulnerability on both sides. When we look at projects that programs that were launched after that. So it's interesting to see that, for instance, with the Reagan project, SDI, there was the thinking and the rationale in the US that it could still bring some stability to some extent, because, and that was really how Reagan framed it himself, but the idea that these technologies could then be shared, and that instead of relying on mutual vulnerability, countries could rely on mutual security and be able, all, not just the US, but others as well, to protect themselves, and therefore it would make nuclear retaliation or nuclear deterrence obsolete. So, of course, this did not take place, and with the end of the Cold War, we've seen other logics take the field, and what has been developed was really, as you said, Etienne, much more framed and considered as tactical capacity or regional capacity, and really always presented as something that would not hurt strategic stability, would not try to put in question the ability of a potential adversary to conduct a retaliatory nuclear strike in case of a conflict. So that was even after the withdrawal of the US of the ABM Treaty in 2002. It was really, there were efforts to try to show that what was developed was compatible with this logic of mutual vulnerability. And of course, it's interesting because now with the latest missile defense review, but more clearly with the Golden Dome project, as far as we can understand, this restraint is really not considered as essential anymore. And we can really imagine that what is being considered, what is going to be developed, is also aimed at peer or near peer competitors in a logic of also intercepting potential strategic capacities. So this is, of course, a clear evolution which reflects to some extent the fears that were being pushed by the Chinese, by the Russians for many years, fears that might have been sometimes politically motivated, maybe, but that was always calling out the developments of missile defense by their adversary, the NATO, the US, as potentially hurting strategic stability, while sometimes not really mentioning that they were also actually working on this type of systems. So in this context, what does it mean? It means that clearly the logic that we had in the 60s, 70s of trying to look at arms control as a way to potentially address these issues, I think are still relevant in principle, but there are clear obstacles for negotiating arms control agreement on these systems at the moment. Political difficulties, we know that it is extremely sensitive as a type of capacities, and it's very difficult to imagine any progress on constraining arms control on this issue. There are also technical difficulties that we did not have probably in the 60s, 70s, in that the very idea of Golden Dome, as far as we can understand, is to integrate various systems from the tactical, regional, and strategic, and not to have clear delimitation of what the systems can intercept and not, and to really mix together all the data and all the possibilities of interception. So it would be much more difficult to try to differentiate between what is allowed and what is not under an arms control agreement. So with that, I would say, with that reality, we try to look in the report at what confidence building measures can do. And here it seems to us that there are several domains in which it may apply. Of course, as usual, maybe not at the most ambitious type of response, but at a rather pragmatic and short-term ways of bringing some regulation. First of all, regarding space, there are already a number of propositions that have been made. And as I said, one of the developments that we might expect to see is the use of, or the deployment in space, not only of captors and of sensors, but also potentially of interceptors themselves. So it would be useful to try to explore the catalog of confidence building measures regarding space. Second of all, the type of transparency mechanisms that are implied by the Code of Conduct seem to be even more relevant when we see that there is clearly a demand for ballistic missiles. And so the idea of having transparency on where these systems may be located, whether or not they are able to carry WMDs, and when they are being launched for tests is all the more relevant. Lastly, we look at how this type of transparency mechanism that currently exists for offensive weapons may actually be also useful for defensive weapons. And so we propose, for instance, to include in the notification mechanisms, so currently notification of ballistic missile tests, we propose that they could also include the notification of ballistic missile tests by notifying not only the interceptor, but also the missile targets when they are launched.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Now, Susanna, I wanted to ask you, you recently wrote a note on the Ballistic and Poseidon, so two new types of Russian delivery system. Could you explain us how they were actually an answer to the exact problem of US missile defense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I recently wrote about Budivesting and Poseidon because of the recent tests that Russia seems to have completed. And just very briefly to explain what Budivesting and Poseidon are. So Budivesting is a nuclear-powered cruise missile. It is nuclear armed as well, so it is designed to have a very long range because of that nuclear reactor that propels it. And so effectively the idea is that you launch it and they can fly for a very, very long time until it finally kind of zooms in on a target. And this was developed, those novel weapons that Russia has announced were developed kind of with the idea in mind that it would be a response to any potential future US missile defense developments. And then Burevestnik is one of them. And the idea behind it is that because it's a cruise missile, it's more stealthy, it's just, it goes for a very long time, it's harder to defend against. That is a little bit questionable because of its long range. Basically, the longer it loiters, the more time there is to actually track it and intercept it. So it technically could be intercepted with NATO aircraft. Some analysts have also suggested that it could face issues with its guidance system at such long ranges. So it's not a kind of cure-all for Russia, the Burevestnik. The one thing that's kind of interesting is that I think I've seen analysis thus far that it was going to be a static system. It was going to be kind of based, it wouldn't move. But actually, recent statements from the US government suggest that it is going to be road mobile, which means that it will be a bit more survivable because it's going to be able to move around on its launcher. Putin did say that the future ambition for Russia is to develop hypersonic cruise missiles that are nuclear powered, so Burevestnik, but much faster. This is another kind of technological feat that Russia would have to achieve, but it is something that would be harder to defend against. And now Poseidon. So Poseidon is a nuclear armed uninhabited underwater vehicle. It will be launched from a submarine if it works once it's finished, and it is designed by way of being underwater based to overcome traditional missile defenses, right? But obviously it can only hit things like coastal targets because it does stay underwater. And the other thing about it is that it's meant to travel at very just in very deep, much deeper than pretty much all of anti-submarine warfare can go, over a kilometer deep. The thing about the Poseidon is that it is slow again, so it kind of ideally would be, before it's actually released, it will be taken closer to its target by a submarine, at which stage potentially anti-submarine warfare could be employed. The other thing in the future could be to look at torpedo technology with greater autonomy that is able to operate at the same depths that Poseidon does. As well as things like seafloor-based sensor systems that will be able to detect Poseidon in time. But this is the kind of technology that is developing much slower, and Poseidon will be a bit harder to defend against.
Good way for Russia to circumvent the US Golden Dome. Now, Sitki, I know that Turkey is becoming a major player in the military industry segment, and we don't hear a lot on its ballistic. Well, we hear sometimes some news about its ballistic programs because there's been launches of the, I think it's Typhoon system, but we hear less on its missile defense. Can you explain us a little bit the two different programs and how it could be a game changer in the region in the future?
Thanks a lot, Etienne. To begin with, I would like to congratulate Emmanuel and Stefan. I think it's a great report that they put forth because there have been a lot of previous studies, but a lot of them came from United States, the more comprehensive ones, and they are in or against certain political or ideological point of view, whereas this one is like a more neutral appraisal of the picture with various dimensions. So I really enjoyed and benefited reading it. So I mean, my chapeau to both authors. I think it's going to be a very important contribution to the literature on that. Now, having said that, the question about Turkey and its ballistic missile as well as ballistic missile defense programs. Well, I mean, Turkey has been one of the countries to have been influenced by the developments in its immediate neighborhood in the past with Iran and Syria, Iraq, all those countries developing an interest. So Turkey has begun developing ballistic missiles in early 1990s. Not much known fact. And after 25 years of non-interrupted and extensive effort, initially with China support, but more recently, indigenously, we have a whole variety of missiles. Typhoon is one of them, but we have the longer range versions coming up. Like we have Cenk, which is the next generation, about to be tested. It is going to be a separating warhead, most likely a MARV design we are talking about. There are also a whole variety of cruise missiles, long range, in development. And as for missile defense, this has been one area at the end of Cold War, Turkey has preferred leaving to NATO to take care of. So whenever, like 1991 Gulf War, 2003 Gulf War, a Iraqi missile threat, it was met by the deployment of NATO Patriots from Spain, from Germany, from Netherlands, and do you still hear me? Good. Okay. Good thing I had my mobile phone on as a backup. I immediately switched to the other internet connection. So I was talking about Turkey's missile programs, and of course, I mean, this has started changing towards the end of 2000s, and Turkey launched a program to acquire a Chinese missile. Well, it was an international tender won by the Chinese, and over NATO's objections, this was cancelled. Then Turkey decided to develop its own air and missile defense, or air defense systems that will be ballistic missile defense capable at the same time. And in parallel with that, the abnormal, or I would say the anomaly in the process was the acquisition of S-400 from Russia, which did not fit anywhere. I won't go into details. That's a long debate because you asked me the question about what Turkey is doing right now. What do we have in this respect? And we do have the outcome of an entire family of air defense systems, missile systems, starting with short-range, low-altitude, and more recently reaching out last year to long-range, medium-altitude, okay? Or we can even high-altitude, you can call it. It's called SIPER. It's an air defense missile that has at least nominally a ballistic missile defense interception capability in its brochures. Okay, now it's a active radar guided missile, meaning it is flown to the target, and then in the terminal phase of its engagement, it is switching on its radar, active radar seeker. Okay, not hit to kill, blast fragmentation type of warhead. Now, to what extent would that be? Well, this is just entering the service, by the way, the block one of it. Since last year, it is being accepted into service, and it forms the missile defense leg of what Turkey has called Steel Dome, being inspired by Iron Dome, probably since last year. This is a wide array of radars, sensors, command control links, as well as a number of weapon systems, starting with very low altitude, short range, directed energy, going all the way to CPER, which is the longest range, highest altitude. To what extent it will be effective against ballistic missiles? Well, probably in its early iteration, Block 1, that will be quite limited because it's not hit to kill. It doesn't have an IR sensor. It is going to a radar seeker. So perhaps for shorter range, thereby slower ballistic missiles, incoming missiles, yes, a potential. But for longer range missiles, it will need queuing. Besides a faster interceptor and a better sensor, more applicable to missile defense engagements. And by the way, the altitude is only 30 kilometers against airborne targets, which means terminal. It is an equivalent of Patriot PAC-2 in this respect. And the range is around, given against airborne targets, around 100 kilometers, by the way, the Block 1. Okay, this is more or less fits in the same category with Patriot in its PAC-2 version, which is not a very great system in intercepting, especially longer range maneuvering and separating re-entry vehicle type of, or separating warhead type of threats. Now, there is a Block 2, which is under development. It is going to have a longer range, okay, and higher altitude, but the real breakthrough will come in Block 3, which is a dedicated missile defense variant, which is in development right now. Of course, the critical issue there will be, like, I mean, we don't know, at least I don't know, I've not come across with things, whether it's going to be endo-atmospheric, exo-atmospheric, probably endo, okay, exo is a little bit too ambitious. The crux of the matter will be the early warning queuing. Right now, Turkey gets that from US satellites via its membership in NATO. Turkey has ambitions to deploy its own early warning satellites for missile defense. So when and if that happens, and if they are coupled to a high-end atmospheric missile defense system like CPER, I think then we can really start talking about a credible missile defense for Turkey. That was a long answer, but a complete wrap-up of what we have right now in this country.
And just a follow-on question. We know that Turkey is selling a lot, is exporting a lot its military weapons. Could you see Turkey contributing to this proliferation of missile defense through its system? So could they export to other countries and hence fuel this, maybe we can call weapon race?
Well, you will be surprised, but my answer will be yes, definitely. That's in the sense that, well, I mean, the ballistic missiles have become so popular and favored assets by so many countries. Turkey has already sold its ballistic missile products to a few countries. Like, I mean, it's part of the report coming up. We are working on it. Like Indonesia has already ordered and taken delivery of Turkish-built ballistic missiles. Turkey will also sell missile defense systems. I mean, honestly, everybody else is selling them. And if you look at Turkey, its defense industry, Turkey is a country with a comparatively small defense budget, yet with very advanced defense industrial capabilities recently. An obvious way to sustain that, just like for countries like France and others, will be to try to export as much as possible, because your domestic budget is not all by itself enough to sustain it. So yes, I mean, restraints and political considerations and all that, but those things notwithstanding, you will see Turkey like #1 drone exporter already, UAV exporter. Over 60% of global market is dominated by Turkish companies. I won't be very surprised to see the similar. In fact, surface-to-air missiles were sold in a number of East Asian countries already from Turkey, shorter range. So I won't be surprised at all to see the same trend continue with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and missile defense and air defense systems.
Thank you, Seti. Suzanne, I think you're also part of the HCOC supporting program. What else did you think about this report?
Yeah, absolutely. That was my task to provide some thoughts about the report, and I hate to detract from the discussion of the Turkish missile defense system, but I'll just very briefly give you some of my thoughts, and some of them do overlap a little bit with what Emmanuel said, which I hope means that I'm not entirely off mark. But first of all, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you to Emmanuel and to Stefan for just contributing this excellent paper. I think what it does really, really well is that it brings together and then explores the linkages between missiles and missile defense technology and space security, which they are all intricately linked, but I think that often people tend to think about them as separate categories, and the thinking becomes kind of siloed. So I really appreciate the contribution. But yeah, when you think about the role of missile defense and its evolving role, you of course have to think about the role of missiles themselves, right? And since the dawn of the first nuclear age, at the very beginning, missiles were thought primarily as delivery vehicles for WMDs, for weapons of mass destruction, and especially for nuclear weapons. And the reason for that was that it was pretty much the only useful thing to put on them, because they were awfully inaccurate. And the only time when a conventional warhead made sense was if the user simply did not mind all that much whether its missile was going to completely hit the target. And that's, for example, if the overarching purpose of using missiles is to achieve a psychological effect, a terror effect, which is something that we have seen, for example, in the Iran-Iraq war. But up until recently, basically, missiles were primarily thought of as WMD delivery systems, and that was the primary motivation for trying to curtail their spread when the missile technology control regime was agreed in 1997. But a lot has changed since then. And advancements in technology allowed for achieving far greater accuracy. And for some missiles, we can now talk about the circular error probable, the CEP, that is measured in meters rather than kilometers. It's not to say that all ballistic missiles are so accurate. I think that lessons from Iran's recent attacks on Israel indicate that some of their medium-range ballistic missiles are actually much less accurate than they were advertised. But generally, I would say that the promise of greater accuracy, especially for shorter range systems and for higher end systems, has kind of translated into a promise of being able to achieve decisive military effects with ballistic missiles. And that made conventionally armed ballistic missiles and actually cruise missiles just much more attractive. So as Emmanuel said, we did see increased use of missiles and of ballistic missiles in recent conflicts. Russia-Ukraine war, conflict between Israel, Iran, India, Pakistan. We've seen non-state actors use missiles, the Houthis, I think, most notably. And then we can draw some lessons, and the paper does it so well. It draws lessons from that use. I think just one caveat here is that in the open source, I think we are still a little bit limited. The data that is available to us is still a bit patchy. To analyze even a single Russian missile attack in Ukraine would be a really in-depth, would be a massive ocean endeavor. And then the other factor that Emmanuel also mentioned is that we are observing fairly different conflict environments. Israel, a small territory, was facing a relatively short missile war, had a multi-layered, homegrown missile defense system and support from allied air forces. And then Ukraine, on the other hand, has this massive territory. It has faced a very long conflict, sustained missile attacks that have only intensified in recent months. And its air defenses and missile defenses are kind of made up of just various systems that are a mix between Soviet legacy systems and Western systems, which just really complicates their effective use. Having said that, I do think that there are some lessons offered by observing recent missile use. And I think that the first one is that it appears that ballistic missiles are harder to defend against than any other type of missile. And this can be down to a few factors. Some of them don't have anything to do with the weapon itself. But generally, just ballistic missiles are much faster, and especially if they are employed on a steep trajectory, when they are able to perform the kind of high-angle terminal dive, and if they use penetration aids, such as decoys, with which Emmanuel mentioned. There are also just fewer systems that can intercept ballistic missiles, which is additional complication. The other lesson, I think, is that, mass matters. It matters on the side of the offender. It matters on the side of the defender. For the offender, Emmanuel mentioned that we have seen saturation tactics. We've seen kind of mixes of high-end and low-end weapons being deployed. So kind of large numbers of those mass-producible, cheap one-way attack drones and other weapons kind of accompanying higher-end, more expensive missiles to make sure that they can drown out defenses, overwhelm them, and help the kind of higher-end stuff get through. And on the defender side, I think that in the inventory depth is really crucial for sustaining defenses. And we have seen reports in Israel that Israel started running out of some types of interceptors during the 12-day war. And I think what I want to note here is that I think that air and missile defense can work. It can work really well if, as Emmanuel mentioned, certain conditions are met. And in defense against conventionally armed missiles and well employed and sustainable defenses can dampen some of the psychological and political effects that missile use can bring about. And also the idea at face value is just pretty easy to sell to the publics, right? It is a defensive system, and so it is morally more palatable. And it's a promise of protection, which is enticing for very obvious reasons. But with all that said, I think that missile defense is not a cure-all. It is incredibly difficult to protect populations over a large territory. As Emmanuel mentioned, it is also, I think, well understood and not controversial that it is much, much more expensive to defend than it is to attack. And that calculus is just not changing anytime soon, in my opinion. So, with a range of tools and techniques to kind of cheaply overcome defenses, I think that I just don't see any actors who possess or are looking to possess ballistic missiles changing that decision. But I also don't see anyone who has or is pursuing a defensive capability stopping that endeavor either. I think that it's basically better. It is definitely politically better to try to defend against some threats than none of them. But yeah, that's all in the conventional realm. And I just want to really briefly address the nuclear one, which again, Emmanuel already mentioned. And I think that the argument that a permeable defense system is acceptable when the threat coming at you is nuclear is just much harder to make, and some of the stability between great nuclear powers in the past was kind of standing on the fact that it was seen as undesirable to get those strategic ballistic missile defense system. So, but that's, as Emmanuel mentioned, what Golden Dome is promising. It is promising it on a very, very ambitious timeline. For now, it's just a cluster of ideas that will probably reveal itself in more tangible form at some point. And, how effective it's going to be is to be determined. But I think that it's important to mention that we have seen countermeasure pop up even before it was announced. While the US policy was still that it was a regional threat system. As I mentioned, these include the Russian novel weapons like Poseidon, like Proliferation. They're not that novel, just to add to that. They all have roots in Cold War R&D. I think nothing really ever dies in Moscow when it comes to defense technology. But what I wanted to say is that tracking arms racing dynamics is really complex, right? Because of the development timelines, they're usually very, very long and their programs are secretive. But I think my worry is that states tend to operate on kind of worst case scenario assumptions. Because otherwise the price is simply too high to pay. And on that note, I'll hand over to Etienne.
Thank you very much for this. This was a really interesting in-depth analysis. And I agree with you that, of course, it's always easier to sell a defensive project. And we know that some European countries are really keen on this instead of investing in offensive capabilities. And actually in France, it was the opposite. For a long time, the French government refused to invest a lot in missile defense and preferred to focus on nuclear deterrence in order for our adversaries to be sure that if they attack us, the only means for us to defend ourselves would be to retaliate. And I think it's important to say that as you mentioned, the Golden Dome is has been sold like a promise to defend the whole US territory against any type of attack. And we've seen with Israel that has, as we've been saying, a much smaller territory defending against very like sometimes low-end systems, especially against Houthis attack. For example, in May 4th, there was only one single missile that has been fired against Tel Aviv airport, and it managed to get through, even if Israel has the most comprehensive and efficient ABM system. So that was a real good proof that ABM defenses are not like the absolute defense, and we cannot rely fully on them, especially if we are talking about a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear warhead, because you just need one to create massive damages. And there's been so Javed Alam with I think he's part of the youth HCOC sporting program, who has been writing a comment saying emphasis the fact that Golden Dome it's been solved. So a comprehensive defensive system over the North America, that it's almost impossible to perform in its current form, because it would require, as he said, there's a study by the American Physical Society that estimated that to intercept one single solid fuel missile, it would require up to 1,600 space-based interceptor and maybe up to 36,000. So we see that it's only for one missile to defend against, and this is against North Korea. And we know that against China, that would be able to launch maybe 100 of missiles at a time. It would be much more complicated. So it seems that at least on a strategic level, it's almost impossible to defend against a first strike. But what's concerning is more, I think Emmanuel said that it's to defend. So if a country wanted to carry on first strike, it would then be able to cope what's left of the adversary arsenal with its own missile defense. So this is why it's destabilizing. So Emmanuel, you've been discussing a bit on the different means that could be implemented. I know that there's a major issue on verification means. So if we want to implement trust on this, could you maybe talk a little more on those type of measures and how to build confidence on this?
Sure. I think, and this is really, to be extremely frank, the report is extremely modest on what it proposed, because it's also very realistic on the difficulties that we may face. And for instance, as I was saying regarding arms control, which might have worked and proved efficient at some point of history, it is we are quite pessimistic that it might be possible to negotiate anything really constraining in the future. I think even after the end of the ABM treaty, there were some questions about indeed verification, that some systems were or not designed to have strategic purposes. It was an issue, for instance, with the NATO deployed systems, where NATO was explaining that what is deployed in Europe, in Romania in particular, was not designed to intercept or to put at risk the strategic deterrence of Russia. And there was some proposition that we could visit the sites and show to Russia that it was indeed actually conceived as a system to defend against regional ballistic threats, more from the south, from Iran or other countries. I'm not sure that this type of measures even would really make sense in the current context, because of the implication that I was mentioning before, but also, as Susanna said, because of the very, very politicization of the issue, which means that at some point it becomes extremely difficult to accept constraint on one system. And I think even to really build on what was said, to agree currently to have countries agreeing that they are allowed to have tactical missile defense that can intercept against conventional strikes, but they refuse to protect their populations against a nuclear strike would potentially be extremely difficult to defend publicly, and to explain this logic that it is indeed serving stability in the long run. So I think these are some of the obstacles that we mention, and why we tend to put forward some much more modest propositions, of course, regarding the launches, regarding the testing of the missile defense system, and regarding the deployment potentially of interceptors in space.
Thank you very much. Susanna, we have a question for you. You mentioned that the new Russian weapons are not that novel, and our spectator want to ask you if you could say a bit more about the origins of those systems.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. All of these systems have their origins in Cold War era R&D. So, for example, if you think about the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, so that development of this program started under the name Albatross in like mid 1980s. Then, when you think about Burevestnik, this can be traced back to Soviet research on nuclear propulsion for aircraft. That was an idea as well. For Poseidon, I think as early as like late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviets were looking at nuclear-powered torpedoes. And all of these programs kind of went dormant or slowed down at some point, I think also in reaction to the geopolitical environment. But obviously, this technology that was developed then was then able to be built upon to accelerate the existing programs. So, yeah, nothing new, as I said. Everything's kind of been done or tried in some form before.
Thank you very much for that, Susanna. Sidki, I know you're more like a technical expert, so could you give us your point of view on the feasibility of a project such as Golden Dome?
Well, I mean, Etienne, it is an answer that is not going to relate too much to my technical expertise, I'm afraid. It is the way I see the Golden Dome. It is at least the third time around, or the third iteration of this fixation on the part of Americans. Not all of them, of course, but certain part of their political spectrum, who is fixated with this idea that they should protect the Americans. They cannot accept the possibility of exposing their population, keeping them vulnerable to other countries. So like their fixation in the first, second, and third iterations of this ballistic missile defense drive is not, or were not, based on technological, operational, arms control, strategic stability considerations too much, okay? This is what we teach our students at undergrad level as American exceptionalism. I mean, we can kill others, they cannot kill us. I mean, they can't do the same for us. Now, from that perspective, it's not all that relevant whether it makes cost efficiency sense or whether it makes operational sense. It does to a certain extent to serve the American interest, but what kind of cost and political ramifications and strategic ramifications it's going to bring about, I don't think they are really that much appreciating or caring about that at this stage. And I think one aspect missing in this paper, not as a criticism, but as a future study venue, is like, what is the role of military-industrial complex in all this debate? I mean, whose vested interests are at stake? Which segments of US industries plus political spectrum to benefit more from a Golden Dome? I mean, this may be quite related to the kind of issue we have in front of us right now.
That's very interesting, and maybe a political question, so maybe
Exactly.
delicate to answer.
That's why I said My answer is
Yeah.
not technical purely,
Yes,
but
yeah. That's a really good point. So, actually, what's interesting is when the Golden Dome project was announced, we've seen many comments, especially coming from China. And it's also interesting to see that in the meantime, they unveiled, as I mentioned a bit earlier, their own strategic defense program with the HQ-29, HQ-19, and HQ-9C. So this multi-layered system, pretty much like what Israel have been doing, but we can assume at a much larger scope. We still don't know what they intend to protect. Will they protect their own nuclear forces against a first strike, or will they try to protect their own population center? We also know that Russia has been investing a lot in missile defense. We know about the S-500 that has been presented as being able to intercept ICBMs. We know that there's the A-135 ABM system protecting Moscow. So it's not only the US. We know that Moscow and Beijing like to put the blame on the US, but they also invest a lot. And of course, in Europe, we have the Sky Shield initiative, even if it's only focusing on shorter range threats. So it will be interesting to see what the different developments are, and if we at some point all the players will realize that it's becoming too expensive, and if they will agree to put an end on such a race and start to discuss with each other like they did in the 70s. So maybe we can leave the last words to Emmanuel, who has been writing this note.
Thank you so much. No, maybe to jump back first, thanks to Susanna and Sitki for reading the paper and taking the time to make remarks and suggestions. I think I come back from our conversation with three points really that struck me. The first one, of course, is that with this type of programs, they don't really have to be implemented to already have consequences. And I think that's one of the points that Susanna was making with the Russian programs. SDI did not actually come about, has never been deployed, but it really had an impact on Russian thinking, on Chinese thinking, and led to some programs that maybe we see today. So whether or not Golden Dome is going to actually be something else than just a name on the paper, it will probably have an impact. The second element I think that really I found extremely important is that it's extremely hard to assess the efficiency of missile defense in a very objective way. Actually, I don't think it can ever be objective. It's always depending on circumstances, on what you expect from missile defense, and so what the result is depends on your expectation. And we see that it can really there can be a little bit of a battle of narrative on this aspect as well. So on the efficiency of the interceptions themselves, but also on the consequence of having defensive systems. And here again, if we look back at the history and we look at what was expected when SDI was announced by the Reagan administration, there was conversation that it could create an arms race, that the Soviet Union would increase largely its offensive systems. Of course, it did not actually take place historically, but still the narrative that SDI was part of what led the Soviet Union to ruin itself into defensive spending is something that stayed a little bit in the narrative. And so the idea that it could have an impact, even once again, if it was not really deployed, has been around for a long time. The last element, we mentioned the fact that missile defense remains attractive, so it's quite difficult to imagine that countries will renounce this possibility to attempt at least to protect their population. What I think is essential while funding or defending those projects is to keep in mind, of course, the implications, whether they are industrial, whether they are strategic, whether they they have to do with the action-reaction cycles that can be started. And so we hope that proposing to focus on some of the modest role that confidence building measures can play can maybe address some of the most problematic or destabilizing behaviors that can be implied by these developments.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel and Susanna and Seki for being with us today, and to all of you who attended this webinar. It's been a pleasure to discuss with all of you. Yes, I invite you to read this report that you can find of the HCOG supporting program or on the FRS website. And have a good day. Bye.